Hello and welcome to Topic 1, Lecture 1. And in this lecture, we're going to be defining government and politics. So what are we going to be learning about in this lecture? Well, first we're going to define the concept of government. We're going to be looking at and learning about different forms of government with a special emphasis on placed on who's doing the governing, and also looking at how much control or power does the government have over those it's governing. And then we're going to talk about the difference between government and politics. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so let's start with defining government. Your textbook defines government as the institutions and procedures through which a territory and its people are ruled. You know, when we get to the second unit in the class, this is basically what we're going to be learning about. We're going to be learning about the specific governmental institutions that preside over the people of the United States, and then we're going to be learning about the rules and procedures that they use in order to do that governing. Now, governments can be, governmental institutions, governments can be different for a lot of different reasons. The type of government you have might be much smaller if it is presiding over a very small territory. The governmental institutions could be really huge if it's, governing over a much larger territory. And so, that there's lots of different types and forms of government that we're going to be learning about in this lecture, but the basic definition is the one that you should keep in mind as sort of a foundation. Now, regardless of whether a government is large, small, wherever it's sort of like, whether it's a government that is, ruling over as an autocracy or a democracy, the governments have specific functions, regardless of the type of government that it is. So let's take a look at what some of those specific functions are, and we'll use a concrete example from a recent example from American government to get an idea of these different kinds of functions in action. So one function that all governments have is what's known as the legislative function. In other words, governments make decisions, okay? And so governments make lots of kinds of decisions. They may make decisions about what kind of behavior is considered forbidden or like criminal in a territory. They make decisions regarding scarce resources, and so that if taxes are collected and the way that those taxes, that money is distributed throughout the land, or whether or not even taxes are going to be, collected, those are all sort of decisions that are made. Recently, we're seeing some, examples regarding decisions of scarce resources out west where there's a drought. Governments are making decisions, basically telling you when you cannot use water. So all of those are good examples of that legislative function. The second function that all governments share is the executive function. And what the executive function means is that once those decisions are made, the decisions are put into action, okay? You can make as many decisions as you want, but if those decisions are actually not enacted or implemented on the people living within that territory, then those decisions are meaningless, right? And so that, in other words, if you're going to confer a benefit on somebody, let's say like during the pandemic, benefits were conferred regarding an extension of unemployment and, child tax credits to help families that might be struggling during the pandemic. Those decisions need to be implemented to have an impact on the people within that society. And that's an example of that executive function. And then the final function is the judicial function, okay? And so decisions are made, those decisions are put into action. But then there's the judicial function. And the judicial function is basically settling disputes. Disputes will arise about the constitutionality of the decisions that have been made or the way in which those decisions are being implemented, okay? And so let me give you a concrete example that, brings sort of this, the different functions into like play. So over the summer, the Biden administration passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. It's a gun safety act, okay? So the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And it was signed into law in June of 2022 following the shootings in Uvalde, Texas at the elementary school, and then also the shootings at the the supermarket in Buffalo. And so Congress, after over 30 years, in a bipartisan manner, that means that there were both Democrats and the Republicans who supported this act, basically said we have to take some action on gun control measures. And they're really sort of constrained actions by many measures, but they are the first decisions that have been made in quite some time. You might have read about this, that, this act, basically gives extra scrutiny to those under the age of 21 who are wanting to purchase a weapon, an arm, and so they have an expanded background check. Also, that a change is giving money to states in order to implement red flag laws like tagging people who have mental health issues, etc. And so that's the decision that was made, and then that goes to the executive branch where they implement that. So with these expanded background checks for those under 21, that will be implemented by the Department of Justice, in particular the FBI and the Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco and Firearms. And then the judicial function. We know that there's going to be, issues that arise over this bill or this law, asking the question, is this law actually constitutional? Some are already saying that placing particular or additional scrutiny on those under the age of 21, that might very well violate the Second Amendment. And so that will be sent to the Supreme Court potentially to determine the constitutionality, to settle the dispute over the constitutionality of the law. And so, keep this in mind as we're learning about the different types of governments. So on this slide, you see many different representations of government. On the upper left-hand side, you see the Karuk Tribal Council. On the upper right-hand side, you see the Saudi Arabia Council of Ministers. Right next to my face, you see the U.S. House of Representatives. And on the bottom left-hand corner is the Waukesha City Council. And all of those are examples of government. They all preside over a particular territory. And so for the Karuk Tribal Council, they preside over the folks who live in their tribe. It's a tribe from California. Waukesha City Council governs over the people who live in Waukesha. The United States House of Representatives, as a national body, presides over the nation. And the Saudi Arabia Council of Ministers. In a moment, we're going to be talking about different types of government. That the United States is a democracy, Saudi Arabia is an autocracy. And so, but there is a Council of Ministers that assists the King of Saudi Arabia in doing their job. And so that is another distinct example of government. Okay, so we've talked about the definition of government. Let's turn our sights now to the second thing we're going to be learning about in this lecture, which are forms of government. And keep in mind that first we're going to take a look at the question of who's doing the governing, and next we're going to take a look at how much control does the government have over its people. So one question we ask when we're learning about government is who's doing the governing, okay? And one of the things when we take a look at the different types of governments that your textbook talks about, you're going to notice that there is a common suffix that is used in words that refer to government. And the common suffix is crassy, okay? And so, for example, democracy, okay? That you see that in the green, the suffix there. And that crassy suffix is derived from the Greek word kratos, which means to rule or who has the power. And so as we are looking at different words that refer to or different types of government, and we'll see that suffix over and over again, that we will look at that and then we'll say, okay, well, it has crassy, but then it must, who is doing the governing, right? In a democracy, demos refers to the people. It used to actually be referred to the masses, right? And it was seen as sort of a dangerous form of government by the Greeks, at least by Socrates. And so in a democracy, it's the people or the masses who are doing the ruling. And so let's look at other types of government. And so you see the word autocracy, okay? That's not how you pronounce it. It's pronounced autocracy. And you know that it has to do with power, that somebody's doing the ruling. And so you have to ask yourself, autocracy, rule of the cars? No. Autocracy, and you're probably familiar with that word because we've been hearing that word a lot, particularly in relationship to Russia and its war against Ukraine and it being referred to as an autocracy. That an autocracy is a type of government that where one person is doing the ruling, right? Where there's one major person who has all the power and makes all the decisions. It could be a major party, like in China, the Chinese Communist Party, but in Russia, it's Vladimir Putin, right? Now, historically, we see that there are different types of governments that are autocracies. The Queen of England, may she rest in peace, died over the weekend. And so, that's a form of autocracy. Well, at least historically, it's a constitutional monarchy now. But a monarchy is the rule of a king or a queen. And who's doing the ruling is passed down through a heredity line, right? Through genetics. A dictatorship is, rule of a dictator, right? And so certain types of autocracies can be dictatorships, okay? Oligarchy is rule of the oligarchs. And what does oligarchy refer to? Well, when you see that, it means that there's a few people that are doing the ruling, okay? Oli refers to the Greek a few, okay? And there are different types of oligarchies one is like an aristocracy. The Greeks wrote about the aristocracy and basically saw the rule of the few as actually one of the better types of government. Socrates in particular, talked about how a rule of the philosopher kings, right? It was this group of people who were selected at birth who were then, basically taken from their families and raised up to be these philosopher kings who would rule according to virtue. Okay. That is aristocracy. There's other types of rule of the few that are not, it's a group of few people who are doing the ruling, but maybe with not an eye to virtue. And another example of an oligarchy, rule of the few, is plutocracy. It's basically rule of the wealthy, that those who have the most money are the ones who are in positions of power, and that they're making rules that benefit and reinforce the wealth of the few. Some people view sort of the United States as moving towards a plutocracy in terms of the great divisions of wealth within the United States and how it's sometimes difficult to get laws passed that are distributing that wealth. Theocracy. Let's see. We know it's crassy, to rule. Theo. What does Theo relate to? My dog's name is Theo. Hey, maybe it's rule of the poodles. That'd be pretty cool, but it's not. So when you think about theocracy, Theo, the Greek root of that is theology. And so that is a rule of religious leaders, rule of the clerics. And so that picture I had on the previous slide that basically showed that minister, a council of ministers in Saudi Arabia, that Saudi Arabia is a theocracy. In Saudi Arabia and also in Iran, it is it's the Quran that is the final word on laws in those countries. Unlike other countries where the final rule of law is in a constitution. And so democracy, as I mentioned, that demos comes from the Greek rule of the people. Okay. And so all of these, to rule, and we see that there's lots of different types of governments. So let's dig in, since this is a class on American government, which has a form of democracy or a form of government of democracy. Let's dig in and learn more about democracy now. Okay, so one aspect of learning about government in that concept is asking the question, who's doing the governing? Another important aspect of learning about government is thinking about how much control is over those who are actually doing the governing. In other words, are there limits placed on the power of government? And so in this section, we're going to be learning about three different sort of a spectrum of power in terms of the amount of power that's placed on those doing the governing. So we're going to learn about totalitarian, authoritarian, and constitutional government. And At the top, totalitarian government, that's the type of government that has very few limits placed on its power to govern. And at the bottom is constitutional government, where there are a lot of limitations placed on the power of government. So let's take a look at each of these individually. Okay, so as I just mentioned, a totalitarian form of government is the type of government that has unlimited power. These types of government recognize little to no limits on their authority. There might be a constitution, but they don't follow the constitution. Those in government don't. There might be laws, they don't follow the laws. Totalitarian governments can basically, that there's no limit on their governing authority. And, in a second, we're going to be talking about authoritarian government. I'm going to give a concrete example for each of these. But the difference between totalitarian government and authoritarian government is that it's called totalitarian government for a reason, because these kinds of governments have complete domination over all aspects of the people's lives that live in those territories. So that totalitarian governments obviously have ultimate control over the laws, and there's nothing limiting, well, they're going to, outlaw this or, criminalize that, that they can do whatever they want. But that it doesn't just stop at laws, in terms of the domination over people's lives. There can be domination in terms of how they dress. There can be domination in terms of not allowing certain cultural manifestations, certain forms of theater, art, reading, books, right? Total domination. So good examples of totalitarian governments. We don't have a lot of examples anymore, but in the mid part of the 20th century, we had a lot of examples, or several examples, of totalitarian government. Nazi Germany under the Nazi regime under Adolf Hitler, that's a good example of a totalitarian government. The lives of people who lived in Germany were totally dominated, to the point of some being sent to death camps, and to others who, were not, were seen as German citizens. They could only listen to certain kinds of music or read certain kinds of books, etc. China under Mao Zedong from the late 1940s to the middle part of the 1970s, that's an example of a totalitarian government. Mao Zedong had complete domination over all aspects of people's lives, so much so that during the Cultural Revolution, those who worked in cities were forced to go and work in farms so they could get an understanding of what life on the farm was like. Authoritarian governments technically also have no limits on their power. They can do whatever they want. However, authoritarian governments focus control on certain aspects of society, particularly those aspects of society that are deemed as threats to the power of government. So an authoritarian government might, that it may allow the presence of political parties that could have some moderating effect on the authoritarian government. However, an authoritarian government, if one political party is threatening the power of those who are in power, they'll crack down on that governing party, okay? It could very well be that, like in China today, which is more of an authoritarian style of government, that there is, the Chinese government really can crack down on and use its power as it wants. Example, the constant testing that's currently going on in China in terms of testing for the coronavirus, right? People's lives are just dominated by that. However, the Chinese government allows there to be a free marketplace as long as that marketplace is sort of reinforcing the power of the communist government, okay? If it's not, then it's going to crack down on it. And then the type of governments that have the most constraints on its power are constitutional governments. And constitutional governments are formally limited by a thing called a constitution. And so in the Constitution, it clearly enumerates what power the government has. It also specifies what the kinds of actions that the government cannot engage in. And then there's a consequence, at least in theory, for if the government engages in that kind of abuse of power, that there's a consequence that they will be prohibited or prevented from abusing their power, okay? So those are the three types of governments from a power perspective. So what kind of government is the United States? Well, the United States is known as a constitutional democracy. So what does that mean? Well, as we were just talking about, the United States is a constitutional form of government. In other words, all of the government in the United States is limited by the United States Constitution and federal and state law. And so government must, its actions must correspond with federal law. It also must correspond with what's the state law, particularly, like a state legislature is bound by state and federal law, okay? The federal legislature is bound by federal law. And those who work in our government, like the president or the members of the Supreme Court, their powers are limited by the United States Constitution. And if there is a violation if a president violates the United States Constitution, or if Congress engages in an act that violates federal law or violates the Constitution, there are going to be consequences for violating the rule of law, for violating these laws. So let me give you some concrete examples. When President Bill Clinton was president in the 1990s, he was a governor of Arkansas, and many governors have what's known as the budgeting veto authority. When they get a budget, they can go through the budget and they can line item veto things. And so our governors in Wisconsin have that. Governors can cross out things in a budget and then pass the budget. The president of the United States does not have that power. It is not in the Constitution. And so when Bill Clinton was president, he acted like a governor, and he was doing some line iteming vetoes. And states that were adversely affected by those line item vetoes, they basically engaged in a lawsuit saying that this was unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court heard the case and agreed that the president does not have that power. It violates the Constitution. Okay, and that's just one of many examples of the consequences for violating the rule of law. We'll be learning about those throughout the course of the semester. Another aspect of constitutional government is it's not just the government that has to follow the laws, but that the people are protected from the government's abuse of power. Okay, and so government can't, write laws that are unconstitutional, that they, can't. Congress can't do things, or presidents can't do things that aren't in the articles. However, but also the government can't do certain things that might harm the people, and that we find those limitations in civil rights and in civil liberties. And so the Bill of Rights is basically telling government what it can't do. It can't establish a church. It can't take away a person's right to bear arms. It can't search somebody without probable cause, right? And then we have civil rights acts. It's in the Constitution. It's also law. We'll be learning about that basically tells government that it can't discriminate against people on the basis of sex, race, etc., which we'll be learning about. So those are the foundations of constitutional government, and that's how it plays itself out in the United States. So the United States isn't just a constitutional form of government, but it's also a democracy. That's the kind of form of government it has as well. And so, as we know from previous slides, democracy is rule of the people. What does that mean? We'll be talking about this throughout the course of the semester, so this is just sort of the beginning. When we say that it's rule of the people, we're basically saying that it's the people who have sovereignty. It's not a king who has ultimate power to rule. It's not a group of people who have the ultimate power to rule. It's the people that have the ultimate power to rule. And that's what popular sovereignty is. The people are sovereign. And that, your textbook defines it as that the political authority ultimately rests in the hands of the people. Okay. Now, the kind of ultimate authority that the people have in the United States is limited. We are not a direct democracy. We'll talk about that in a second. But the United States is known as a republic, or a representative form of democracy. And if you ever hear people say that the United States isn't a democracy because it's a republic, that's just not a true statement. A republic, or representative form of democracy, is a democracy. When we say that we are a republic, what that means is the way that people have sovereignty is through the legal opportunity that they have to elect governmental officials. Okay, and so people have the right to elect people to represent them, and then the representatives go to government, and then they represent the people and the will of the people, at least in theory. And if we don't like the job that they are doing, then we have an opportunity to elect somebody else who's going to do a better job. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, the United States, at least at the federal level, is not a direct democracy. A direct democracy is a type of system where citizens vote directly on laws and policy. Okay. So, sticking with the example I used earlier about the Gun Control Act that was passed earlier, we didn't ask Americans to vote on that law and that have a referendum on that federal law. We don't have that in the United States. We have that in states. We'll talk about that later in the semester. And so the type of democracy that we have is a more indirect type of democracy. It is a representative type of democracy. Though we do have little tastes of direct democracy at the state levels, but at a federal level, we are not a direct democracy. All right, so we've defined government, the institutions and procedures that rule over others. Now let's move on to talk about what the difference between government and politics is. And we touched on some of this in the opening lecture for the first week and also in the written commentary. So politics is about power, okay? So politics is the conflict that people engage in over who's going to lead us, the structure of our government, and the policies that that government passes. And so throughout the course of the semesters, you're learning about American government and politics. You're going to see politics in action. One of the first things we learn about is the crafting of the United States Constitution, the struggle for power over the structure of the United States government. And that was basically different delegates from different states coming and saying, oh, we want the structure to be this way. No, we want the structure to be this way. And then sort of a compromise in terms of what the structure is going to look like. And that's an example of politics. And so, we struggle to get power to influence who leads us, and who leads us, who gets elected, it enacts certain kinds of policies. And political participation is the main way that people exercise influence in a democracy. We're going to be learning more about that during the course of the semester, but let's take a look at a couple of pictures of politics in action from recent days. So one way that people try to influence who leads us and the policies that get enacted is by voting. And so you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, that is a picture from the 2020 primary election, where it was in the midst of the pandemic and there were some changes to absentee balloting and people were lined up for, blocks. I remember driving by and seeing all the folks lined up to vote. And so voting is probably the main way that you're going to engage in politics in your life. In the bottom left-hand corner is, a way that individuals can get even more actively involved in politics. And those are people who are engaged in what's known as GOTV, get out the vote. And so that elections are won and lost oftentimes by who gets out to vote. And so some people get involved in politics by encouraging people to vote and signing them up to register to vote. And then even going further, not GOTVers, but campaigners who would go knock on doors, canvassing, encouraging people to come out to vote. I tried to look for some signs of like Johnson v. Mandela Barnes, but I couldn't find two signs together. So I had to go with an older one from the presidential election of 2020. You got the Trump versus Biden. And so putting campaign signs in your lawn is a form of political participation. And then up in the upper right-hand corner is a picture from protests that took place over the summer. As we know, Roe v. Wade was overturned, and that made some people happy. It made some people upset. And that's an example of some people who are upset by the right to have an abortion being taken away from them by the Supreme Court. All of these are examples of politics in action. Okay, that's it for this lecture. You've got another lecture to listen to this week. And in the next lecture, we're going to be looking and digging in more deeply into democracy. We're going to look at what are the key components necessary for living in a democratic society and just how healthy our democracy is and what are some of the factors that need to be in place to have a healthy democracy. Okay, thanks a lot for listening. Appreciate your time and effort, and I'll talk to you again soon.